Make of yourselves a light, said the Buddha before he died. I think of this every morning as the east begins to tear off its many clouds of darkness, to send up the first signal, a white fan streaked with pink and violet, even green. An old man, he lay down between two sala trees, and he might have said anything, knowing it was his final hour. The light burns upward. It thickens and settles over the fields. Around him, the villagers gathered and stretched forward to listen. Even before the sun itself hangs, disattached in the blue air, I am touched everywhere by its ocean of yellow waves. No doubt he thought of everything that had happened in his difficult life. And then I feel the sun itself as it blazes over the hills like a million flowers on fire. Clearly, I'm not needed. Yet, I feel myself turning into something of inexplicable value. Slowly, beneath the branches, he raised his head. He looked into the faces of that frightened crowd. This is not some ancient sutra from the Pali Canon or anything. It's actually a modern day poem written by Mary Oliver, the Buddha's last instruction. We Buddhists would love to claim Mary for our own. She never committed, but so many of her writings speak to our hearts, and certainly to mine. So good Sunday morning, everyone. And welcome all you Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and as I always say, you future corpses. And that has kind of a special meaning with our topic this morning, which is on the teachings of the Parinirvana. First, we remember the indigenous peoples of this land. And my teacher, Roshi Gyoku, had written some words to use for this, and it's I feel that it's almost a prayer. So please put your hands in Gasho. And I'd like to acknowledge and pay my deep respect to the Northern Chumash people and elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. I acknowledge and offer deep gratitude to this Northern Chumash land and water that supports us today as we're gathered here right now. And I invite you to join me in that acknowledgement, that respect, and that gratitude. Hadrian Commons, he was a co-founder of the Lenape Center. It's an indigenous group up in New York. And while this acknowledgement that we do may be a mere formality in some contexts, he emphasized that he sees it as something much greater, an invitation to consider and appreciate where really you're standing right now, or in our case, where we're sitting right now. He said, we're part of a living being. Earth is a living entity. So in acknowledging land, what we're really doing is acknowledging life, not nationalism, not patriotism, but life. So today I'll be speaking on Parinirvana. And what better place to start to figure this out than to talk about or use the definition of Parinirvana from the Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism. But before I do that, I did want to say, we have kind of three services that we perform or that we do surrounding the Buddha each year. And the first is commemorating Buddha's his birth, and it's usually around April 8th. And it's a beautiful service, and oftentimes we do it very small scale with our Sangha, but usually it's kind of a big deal. And there's a gazebo sometimes just covered with beautiful, beautiful flowers. And everybody's given a flower, and there is a statue of the baby Buddha, his arm pointing up to the sky. And we all take turns going up, offering the flower as if we would offer incense, and then bathing the Buddha, taking this little ladle, and each one of us gets to bathe the baby Buddha. And then Dharma words are offered. And Dharma words, by the way, those of you that aren't familiar, there's a format for it. And the first little section deals with bringing you into the here and now. So it's something about place, kind of like what we just did with the indigenous people. But it brings you into the place where you are. And then there's the kind of introduction and appreciation for whoever it may be. So sometimes it's for the founders. On Buddha's birthday day, of course, it's for the baby Buddha being born. And then at the end of that section, normally with Dharma words, there's this line that's supposed to bring your attention, get your attention. And so on. And I just wanted to make sure I had the original sound on, because otherwise my E would be truncated. So in the case of the Buddha's birthday, we instead, the chanter or the officiant, will cry like a baby for that line. And then that is followed by a sutra, something that one of the, from the sutras, or something that a master has written. We've often talked, well, especially Deborah, she's been involved with a lot of these up in San Francisco Zen Center. And we've often talked about, that would be so cool to do something like that here. Maybe do a joint thing with the White Heron Sangha outside. And anyway, maybe someday. And then the second service is for Buddha's awakening, and that's usually around December 8th. And in our tradition at ZCLA, it's always connected with the Ruhatsu Sesshin, which commemorates Buddha's awakening. The whole sesshin is dedicated to that. And then finally, a Parinirvana, normally around February 15th, mid-February. It ties with the full moon. And then actually, I wanted to say something about rituals, because, a lot of us, many people, there's a hang-up about ritual. And it's interesting to see. And a lot of it is that people have kind of a disconnect. A lot of us have come to Zen from other faith traditions, and you're trying to get away from the liturgical aspects. And so a lot of people just kind of turned off by it. I was listening to a talk by Norman Fisher, and he has a theory on this. And he said that it's during this process of being involved in liturgical services, he thinks that it's upsetting that we realize that our own life is such a small thing, feeling less significant. Somehow, he says, losing ourselves a bit. And it's an interesting concept. And yet, and he agrees, maybe losing ourselves a little bit may be a good thing. Our whole practice is kind of oftentimes a shift into becoming less selfish. And then lastly with that, it's very Japanese, our services, although things have been gradually changing. Everything at GCLI used to be in Sino-Japanese, not in English. Now most of our chants are in English. And so for some people, this cultural thing is kind of a turnoff as well. And yet, if you do it long enough, it does become your own. It becomes a part of you, and it begins to shape your life. So back to the Parinirvana. So the Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism says in Sanskrit, and it's Parinirvana in Pali and Hatsunehan in Japanese. But in Sanskrit, final nirvana or complete nirvana is the final passage into nirvana upon the death of a Buddha or an Arhat. And Buddha was an Arhat. He wasn't the only Arhat. There were many of them. But it's most widely associated with the passing of the historical Gautama Buddha. And there are delineations of the Buddhist path, the dictionary says, that set forth the experience of nirvana into two phases. And the first phase occurs when all the causes for future rebirth have been destroyed, at which point one becomes a Buddha or an Arhat. However, the karmic seed that had, big word, fructified as the final lifetime has not yet run its full course, and thus the enlightened person does not instantly die and pass into nirvana, but instead lives out the remainder of his or her lifetime. And this is sometimes referred to as the nirvana with remainder. And when the term of the last lifetime comes to an end, there is a total extinction of all conventional physical and materialistic existence, because the adept has previously brought an absolute end to any propensity toward defilement, and, as the dictionary says, eradicated all the causes that would lead to any prospect of future birth. And this is sometimes referred to as nirvana without remainder. And Norman Fisher speaks to 4 fruits of practice, and these are kind of woven into that. And the first is the stream, entering the stream, or the stream winner, sometimes it's referred to. And second is the once returner. And the third, the never returner. And the final is the Arhat. So this is the Parinirvana, the Maha, if you will, big nirvana. And so nirvana itself, the word nirvana, is extinction. And it's the earliest and most common term describing achieving the goal of Buddhism. And it's commonly interpreted as meaning blowing out, as when a flame is blown out by the wind. And sometimes this is glossed as the extinction of the flame of desire, or most broadly, the extinction of the 3 poisons. Right? And we chant those all the time. We have embellished a little bit to 5 of them. Actions, born of my action, speech, and thought, but it's beginningless greed, hatred, lust, envy, and delusion. And the 3 are greed, anger, and ignorance. So those are all extinguished. So the Pali Canon has a Parinirvana Sutra. And this is the Maha, big, Maha meaning big, Maha Parinirvana in Pali, Parinirvana Sutta. And it is Sutta 16th in the Dingha Nikaya. And it is belonging to the Sutta Pitaka of Theravadan Buddhism. And this entire thing, and it's actually, this is the longest sutta in the Pali Canon. It goes on and in great, great detail. And it is normally, because it goes into so much detail, it's reported to be it's the principal source of reference in most of the standard accounts of Buddha's death. And so the whole sutra is dealing with the last days of Buddha. And there's a Theravadan take on that. And, it's dealing with the final days of this human being, this historic person of Buddha. And by the way, not being Ananda, who was Buddha's attendant for so long, and of course had this unbelievable memory where they say he listened to all of the preachings of the Buddha and memorized them all. And so he was able to regurgitate these, and that became essentially the Pali Canon. I don't have that gift. So a lot of this stuff is a lot of, sacred texts. And so I will be referring to my notes a lot. Karen Armstrong wrote a book called Buddha, and she does a wonderful job of kind of summarizing or coming up with different conclusions for this particular Parinirvana Sutra. And she said at one point in this is Ananda, who was far from young himself, and keeping in mind Buddha is old at this point. He's 80 years old. He's taught for over 40 years at this point. And Ananda, who was far from young himself, had recently been dismayed by the change in his master. His skin was wrinkled, his limbs were flaccid, his body was bent, and his senses seemed to be failing. So it is, Ananda, the Buddha agreed. Old age was indeed cruel. But the story of the Buddha's last years dwells less on the aesthetic disaster of aging than on the vulnerability of the old. So there's these many, many stories in there that are just pretty horrific. It tells of ambitious young men rising up against their elders, sons killing their own fathers. And in this final phase of the Buddha's life, the texts dwell on the terror of a world where all sense of sacredness is lost. Egotism reigns supreme. Envy, hatred, greed, and ambition are unmitigated by compassion and loving kindness. People who stand in the way of a man's craving are ruthlessly eliminated. All decency and respect has disappeared. By stressing the dangers that the Buddha had tried to counter for nearly 50 years, the scriptures force us to confront the ruthlessness and violence of the society against which he had launched his campaign of selflessness and loving kindness. And I'm sure you can glean some things that are very parallel to our world today, unfortunately. So at the end, we have Buddha dying. We have Ananda beside himself. He's losing his teacher, somebody that he's served for many, many years. And he weeps. And I actually bring up, hopefully I'll be able to do it, a picture of the Parinirvana. There's some beautiful not scriptures, but scrolls and paintings, and give a little bit of detail to this. And in that picture, you'll see many of the folks depicted are like Ananda. They're in tears. They're losing the Buddha. Buddha kind of gets a little ticked off about this. And he says to Ananda, enough, Ananda, do not grieve, do not lament. For have I not taught from the very beginning that with all that is dear and beloved, there must be change, separation, and severance. Of that which is born, come into being, compounded, and subject to decay, how can one say, may it not come to dissolution? There can be no such state of things. Now, you should put forth energy, and soon you too will be free from the taints. And he also talks to Ananda and many of the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis that are losing their teacher. But he says to Ananda, and it's interesting, he's able with his usual sympathy to enter into Ananda's thoughts. And he says, you may be thinking, Ananda, the word of the teacher is now a thing of the past. Now we have no more teacher. But that is not how you should see it. Let the Dharma, which are the sutras, the teachings, and the precepts, let that and the discipline that I have taught you be your teacher when I am gone. And he had always told his followers to look not at him, but at the Dharma. He himself, he felt, had never been important. Then he turned to the crowd of the monks who had accompanied him on this last journey and reminded them yet again, all individual things pass away. Seek your liberation with diligence. And these were the last words of the Tathagata, and Tathagata means the thus come one. So those are his final words. Some say his final teaching. My conclusion or my opinion is that his dying was in fact his final teaching. And this was underscoring the impermanence of our life. I worked, as most of you know, out at CMC, or have worked for a number of years, and Lori Adolph, I was working with her in the hospice project at CMC. She ran the hospice program, and in her office she had a plaque, and the plaque said, "The dying are our greatest teachers." The dying are our greatest teachers. And here is the greatest teacher being the greatest teacher. But is the Buddha really gone? There's a shift when you get from Theravadan into Mahayana Buddhism. And some of you know the sutra. It's from the Lotus Sutra, but it's called the lifespan. It's one of the chapters in the Lotus Sutra, the lifespan of the thus come one. I think it's chapter 13. And we don't chant it here very often. We chant it normally, like at ZCLI, during sessions, during retreats, and it's done during the noontime service. But here is Buddha speaking. So here are some quotes from that. "I am always here, but through my transcendental powers, I make it so that living beings, in their befuddlement, do not see me even when close by. When the multitudes see that I have passed into extinction, far and wide, they offer alms to my relics. All harbor thoughts of yearning, and in their mind thirst to gaze at me." So this is kind of the Ananda group, that he's gone, and they're offering relics, and there are stupas all over with Buddha's relics. This was kind of by design, and people to this day do this. He goes on later and said that he is like a skilled physician who uses an expedient means to cure his deranged sons. Though in fact alive, he gives out word that he is dead. Yet no one can say he speaks falsely. I am the Father of the world, saving those who suffer and are afflicted. Because of the befuddlement of ordinary people, though I live, I give out word I have entered extinction. So there is kind of a dichotomy here. On one hand, impermanence. The Buddha has died. On the other, this sense that he's always here, past, present, and future. So impermanence versus eternity. Buddha's Dharma body, we call it the Dharmakaya, never ceases, always present, and indestructible. Then there's the impermanent side. No self, everything is suffering. And this is the Nirmanakaya, we say, which is the historical Buddha. So you've got two things going on here. And of course, you may think of the Heart Sutra, no old age and death, and no end to old age and death. So it is, in a sense, a koan, that they're both here. And it was so interesting in preparing, did just tons of research. I talked or listened and read a number of talks by Okumura and Norman Fisher. And it's so interesting to see that many of these people, they came to the same conclusion. And Norman makes the point that the Pali Canon was a skillful means used at the time, because the Buddha says in Mahayana Buddhism that because the people weren't ready for the teaching that the Buddha is eternally born, eternally returning. Right? Anyway, in Zen, I think that we appreciate both views, and that teachers generally, using skillful means, will use one or the other depending on what the needs are in the moment. So I went looking at Dogen to see what he had to say, and he wrote he wrote a lot about this, about the Parinirvana, and both in the Shobogenzo and then this Eihei Koroku, which are a compilation of his discourses over many years. So he wrote, I think there's 3 or 4 that I found over time. But interestingly, in the Shobogenzo, toward the very end, he died in 1253. So there is one of the last writings in there, is last fascicles in the Shobogenzo, is the 8 Awakenings of Great Beings. And this is on the Buddha's Parinirvana. And then he also writes in this Eihei Koroku, which is, again, a compilation of his discourses, many talks that he had given. This is, I can't remember, they have 500 and some, and this is in the 486th discourse, he writes about the Parinirvana. So this is in 1252, and this last fascicle, one of the last fascicles in the Shobogenzo, is written in 1253. So maybe he had a premonition. This was the end of his life. He ended up getting very, very sick. And then his students kind of relived the same thing that Ananda and the other followers and monks and nuns ran up against when they lost their teacher. And Dogen makes this great connection between impermanence and eternity, that they are both here. And in this particular discourse, the 486th, it's very short, beautiful, very short. And in the very end, he has a 4-line poem. And it goes after, it says, it gives this, his discourse, and then it says, after a pause, Dogen said, in Crane Forest, with the moon fallen, how could dawn appear? In Kushinagara, flowers wither, and spring is not spring. Amid love and yearning, what can this confused sun do? I wish to stop these red tears and join in with wholesome action. And hopefully, I can do a shared screen. And Kanjo, can you give me a thumbs up? Can you see that?
Looks good.
And hang on, I am going to minimize something so I can go up and down. I'll expand it in a little bit, but hopefully you can see that. So the crane from this poem, the Crane Forest, the crane, of course, as all of us know, it's a white bird. And during this Parinirvana, the flowers were blooming on these sal trees, even though it was not their season. And soon these flowers wither during the course of this and become white, just like the crane. And that's why Dogen calls this Crane Forest. So it's white. And I don't know that you can see it in this. There's many, many different pictures. Okamura had, I think, a better picture of the solid trees, but you can actually see some of them have green leaves on them and some do not. Some have withered. And so here again is this, the two sides, impermanence and eternity. And these are two sides of the Buddha's life and what we've been just going over. And then up there at the top right, at least on my screen, it is that's Maya, this Buddha's mother coming down from the heavens to bring medicine, but it's too late. So she's actually pours the medicine out onto the trees. And you can see the full moon. So the Buddha dies on the full moon, which is normally mid-month and in February. And the poem goes on about, that's when the moon is falling, it becomes dark. These people are depressed. They're shaken by what's gone on. And with Buddha's passing, how could there be any light? In Kushinagara, flowers wither, and spring is not spring. So this spring, it's not a joyful thing. How could it be spring? We've just lost our master. The world has become dark. And then the third line, amid love and yearning, what can this confused sun do? So it's so interesting in that Buddha puts himself in the same camp as Ananda. He's upset with Ananda and those who are crying. And this love, it's not like the compassion of the Buddha. It's human love and attachment, being attached to the teacher, not yet seeing the Dharmakaya, the Buddha's eternal body. And finally this, I wish to stop these red tears and join the wholesome action. And this is where you can see in the picture that enlightened arhats, free from delusions, they didn't cry. They understood impermanence. The unenlightened cry. And the red tears refers to basically bitter, bitter tears. And the wholesome action is the same as, or means, good karmic causes. So I've expanded, enlarged the picture a little bit so you can see it. Animals, celestial beings. And then Buddha, there of course, is in the Parinirvana mudra, they call it, lying on his right side, head held up by his right hand, and his feet placed on top of one another. Okay. Hopefully you could see that okay, that it worked out. So this was written, as I said, in this Dharma Hall Discourse, number 486, for the ceremony for Buddha's parinirvana. And it's actually the caption of before that, it lists the number 486. It says, "When will we meet the compassionate Buddha?" And that was Dogen's poem at the end. And then in the body of this, just a few lines where he says, "Therefore, nirvana is neither departing nor entering the world, nor hiding in despair, nor is it birth or extinction, nor going or coming. And yet, simply when the opportunity and conditions join together, parinirvana is manifested." That night, this is on his parinirvana night, that night Buddha entered nirvana under the twin sala trees, and yet it is said that he always abides on Vulture Peak. And I have, there's so much more to get to. There's Dogen actually has, even though he was a big promoter of shikantaza and not koan study, he still put together 300 koans. It's called The True Dharma Eye, Zen Master Dogen's 300 koans. And he wrote one of the koans, one of the cases, number 165, is "The World Honored One did not speak a word." And I'm not going to go into all the commentary on it, but it's very, very short. And this was when the World Honored One was about to enter parinirvana. Manjushri asked him to give a sermon, one more sermon. The World Honored One scolded him, saying, "I have not spoken even a word for 47 years. You are asking me to speak once more. Have I ever said a word?" And that's a koan you can chew on. And we'll maybe bring it out in another talk. So this dichotomy, if you will, is the only truth we can count on. And, believe it or not, it's liberating. Norman Fisher said, likens it to the feeling is like waking up from a nightmare and realizing it's just been a dream. And that's what we do in our practice. And I love it. Norman also had said, the good news is there's nothing to hold on to, nothing to worry about. The bad news is there's nothing to hold on to, nothing to worry about. Dogen speaks a lot on impermanence. But he embraces all of this. And I think most of us that have been studying Dogen see this side. He wrote in one of his most important essays, which was Impermanence is itself Buddha nature. This seems quite different from the classical Buddhist notion of impermanence. But for Dogen, impermanence isn't a problem to be overcome with diligent effort on the path. Impermanence is the path. Practice isn't the way to cope with or overcome impermanence. It's the way to fully appreciate and live it. And he wrote a short poem on impermanence. To what shall I liken the world? Moonlight reflected in dewdrops, shaken from a crane's bill. And Norman speaks about this very eloquently, speaks about the fruit of our Zen practice is to accept our confusion, our brokenness, and our pain, and to know that that's not all we are. The Buddha is us. We ourselves. This is the most important thing. The sacredness and perfection of our life in the midst of the mess that we make. So from that, a few lines from that poem, Mary Oliver poem that I began with. And then I feel the sun itself as it blazes over the hills, like a million flowers on fire. Clearly, I am not needed. Yet I feel myself turning into something of inexplicable value. And Uchiyama, who was a teacher of Okumura, on his death poem, toward the end of his life, he was 70 years old and very, very sick. And he wrote, though poor, never poor. Though sick, never sick. Though aging, never aging. Though dying, never dying. Reality prior to division, herein lies unlimited death. Now, there's a catch to all this, and all this. I think of the three pure precepts: cease from evil, do good for others, and that's our vow as bodhisattvas. This doing good for others, and I think I've shared this before. I'll end with this. This is Albert Sejo's poem on the Bodhisattva vows. And Albert was like a contemporary with Allen Ginsberg. He was part of that whole Beat group. Not as well known as like Kerouac and some of the others, but he lived in Hawaii for many years. And I think I either read this once on a Thursday night, but I love this. It also points to the fact that we in Zen can be maybe even disrespectful. In the Pali Canon, a lot of times you see, it's the world honored one. There's the tremendous amount of respect. And then when you slip into Zen, you have things like, what is Buddha? A shit stick. 3 pounds of flax. Anyway, so it's interesting. So he wrote, Bodhisattva vows. Bodhisattva vows to be the last one off the sinking ship. You sign up and find out It's forever. Passenger list endless. Ship never empties. Ship keeps sinking, but doesn't go quite under. On board, angst, panic, and desperation hold sway. Turns out, bodhisattvahood is a fucking job like any other, but different in that there's no weekends, holidays, vacations, no golden years of retirement. You're spending all your time and energy getting other people off the sinking ship into the lifeboats, bound gaily for nirvana, while there you are, sinking. And of course, you had to go and give your life jacket away. So now, let us be cheerful as we sink, our spirit ever buoyant as we sink. Kanjo, if you'll lead us